Dang Gasa and Dang Duki Dunga Sea Da anything Deo Duko, just a Dang Chasa, Deo Duko is a Deo Duelia, and then Nanga Samdu Tony, Diki Tuptachita, and the Chi Twinking on the Diki to the New Benani, Nanga Samdu Tony, Diki Tuptati, some kind of Stanguri, Saji, Kasanga the Dikor Mashudu, and the Garages and Dabo, Nekar some Tangorsen. Then ever to Anzulia, Chiva said, Anzuli Yungrius, and the Kidishing ever your Marias and Pega some Loshita. Then Chiwena, and then Shidrona, never check it with never checking Marias, and never much was a Kiwachima Lingo. Tis not a Kiwachima Lingo with a Kiwachima, Pen de Carriore Lamna. Tis not Anzulia, Cedilla, Luda, Longue, and Sachet, and Nidu Cata, Chubine. Chimal Rodi Disakira Mares, and the Shasha Triares. The names are and down on the sheet of the Karakia Yorasina, Gawasa Yobana, Gawati Kira, Dipasana, Dipas Kira. The names are Nangazulia, Gawat Gantu Sawores, which is not the Gawaya Posavina, and the and Gawachimare, and the Tarbata Temchikim Boko top to Yagi, and Diki Punson Sopo to Yagi, Gudi Dires, which is not on the Gawati to Kores, and the Kasanga the Dikor Shirua.
Good morning. Yesterday, we first started out by talking about how at a fundamental level we are all the same in longing to experience happiness, a happiness that is lasting and stable, that is not punctuated by even a moment of suffering, no matter how slight. And we also spoke about how there are two sources from which we both experience happiness as well as problems. One source being the external material world, and the other being the inner world, the mental world. And thereafter, we started to look at the sequence of trainings that a Buddhist practitioner undergoes to transform their inner world, their mind, so as to eradicate the causes that will otherwise lead to suffering and strengthen the causes that lead to happiness. We started first looking at this precious life that we have achieved with such great potential. Whilst that is the case, it is impermanent. It will not last. Death is certain. And not only is death certain, but the time of death is uncertain, is completely unknown to us. All we can say for certain is death it will come, and it is coming rapidly. Moreover, when death does come, our next rebirth follows immediately. Our next life, our ongoing continuation of lives, that is definite too. And as we transition from this life into the next, this body that we've cared for throughout our life will be left behind. All our loved ones, friends and companions, none of them will be able to accompany us on this journey. So too, all the possessions that we've accumulated, so that we've valued and we've treasured, none of them can accompany us to our next life. All that accompanies us is the karma we've accumulated, both virtuous and non-virtuous. Reflecting well on this, the determination naturally arises that I must use this opportunity well. Whatever remains of this precious life, I must use well. I must use it so as to accumulate virtue, to strengthen my virtuous ways of thinking.
Nyurdo gewi goban tobi tsuls shebarikila ninde shindo sum deterasane tepso trola bes.
Coming to the sixth verse, from non-virtuous karma comes the incessant, intense suffering and misery of the three lower realms. From the paths of the conquerors come the higher realms, wherein progressive levels of virtue are quickly attained. Understand this and reflect on it daily. Having contemplated that, go for refuge earnestly.
다 디베레라 윤ring 슈트라베 아니 나서 숨유 동할 중화 당세 제사당 안저 디버사바이나 디버사비기 레디 레기 제보디 아니 가와기르스나 나서 숨레기 그래서지 제사당 나서 숨 디누슈 윤ring 슈트라바 세디다 베 진나서 숨레야 윤리고 슈지 안에 야도 나서 숨레기야다 안에 지금 안 동아디게네 안에 지금 배 빠도매봐 슈트라고 줘야 되네 용거를 해서 디베레 지단의 시고라. 디비 레기 아주 디바 사시 디비 레기 제부 디바 마샤바체 디바데 샤샤네 메바 소바네 디야야 말바. 제자 디바 사 데네 디바디 마샤바 있나 저기 메바 소마도 바이나 안 디비 레디게 제부디 가와기게스 나소 숨레기레 디바 슈충아 있나 둔조레기 용거레 딜레 슈체와 있나 안은 지게 이달레기 워 딜레 슈체와네 냐와레기 거레스. 제자 슈자 아스네 윤ring 시디 땅 냐와 이다 둔로를 깨베네 개와사요 고급시요 말다 고급시요 말다 디버사요 고급 먹고요다 될래 디버사요 고급이요 근데 제가 디네자 개와사요 메바자데 디버사 야 딘마 나솔게 야 디버사 나솔요 두신 윤리고 슈 윤ring부 차거래 제데 제가 슈자세데네 디바 마마치리 아니 나솔네 이다 되는 냐왈기데 동아디게 아니 빠도메 봐준 거리 해야지 온도시네 단다디스 거래.
Looking at the first two lines, from non-virtuous karma comes the incessant, intense suffering and misery of the three lower realms. Karma that we accumulate can be virtuous or non-virtuous. So that which is non-virtuous or unwholesome should the imprint that ripens at the time of our death that propels our next rebirth be a non-virtuous karmic imprint, it will ripen in propelling a rebirth into one of the three lower realms. That is the ripening result of a non-virtuous propelling karma. If that karmic imprint is of relatively mild strength, one will be born into the lower realm, which has proportionately less suffering, namely the animal realm. If the negative imprint that ripens at the time of death is of middling strength, it will ripen into the suffering lower realm of middling intensity, the spirit realm. And if the ripening imprint is of great strength, then it will ripen into the lower realm, which has the most intense suffering, the hell realms. Once born there, the suffering is incomparable to what we've experienced in this life, hence the term intense suffering. The intensity of the suffering will vary between realms and rebirths within those realms, but it is incomparable to what we've experienced in this life. And that the suffering is incessant refers to the immense duration of time that a being ends up abiding or dwelling in the lower realms. And the reason for such an expansive period of time, the reason why one remains in the lower realms for such an expansive period of time is not only due to the lifespan, but in particular, primarily it is due to the fact that it is incredibly difficult, often impossible, to accumulate virtue in the lower realms. And therefore, not accumulating virtue in the lower realms, one is not accumulating new causes so as to be born out of there. Therefore, a period of time one has to remain in the lower realms is significant. And hence, the rebirths there are incessant or unremitting.
Dadi jidane shigoro dadi du shingure se jidane shigore. Nishishime dadi digbi tebu denetsi yungure se dadi she dadi jidangi ne shigore. 나가서 가르요레스네 나한줄이야 디비 디바 나한주게 나한주게 다 나한주 섬다 디바샤 디바니마 제베네 디바데 샤바이나 아니 디빌레디 샤제 메바 소샤바네 데네 안주게 나솔게 메바제 지기요 말에 되게 디바디 샤제 메바 소 마투바이네양 디바디 샤제 메바 소 마투바이네 안주게 체디글이야 안주 녀모게디 바 슉충다 녀모를 녀버된제 녀모를 게마투바지 게마주바 샤바이나 아니 나솔게 말에 제게 두 말에 제래 제사 디바디 샤바이나 나솔게요 말에 디바 제바이나 다 디바 제네 아니 샤메나 양 안주기 체디기 아주 녀모디 파게디 까샤바이나 아니 나솔게 말에 저래 당한 좀 마서 탑 디바냐마 디바슈 제바이나야 나솔레 체델이야 탑람 나솔 마기가 탑람 유해돼 버려 탑람 가르스네 야네 디바 샤야 돼 샤지메 봤으네 디네 나솔 마기야서야 대개시 디바 샤마투베네 아니 녀모바 나주기 녀모바 게에 바 까샤바이나 게마주바 까바이나 안디 겐지나 안디바 예나양 안디 가서 나솔 기투고 말해지래
The position. So what I've just presented in that previous segment is a general presentation of what happens at the time of death. But there's another important point to make here. When you reflect on your life thus far and how you've lived it, you'll be able to point to a number of non-virtuous events, of non-virtuous karmic events that you have created, or engaged in rather, as well as there'll be many, many others which were subtler and went unobserved. And then if you think of the expanse of lifetimes before this, one can have confidence that on one's continuum there is an abundance of non-virtuous karma. So this is important to recognize, because it's all part of understanding the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. And part of understanding the reality of the situation we find ourselves in is the tremendous potential that comes with a human rebirth, in particular, a precious human rebirth like we all have attained. So whilst we have engaged in non-virtue in the past, and perhaps some of it even quite strong, because of this basis, this precious human life, we have the possibility to purify previously accumulated non-virtue, which means if to the extent that we are successful in purifying non-virtue, those imprints cannot ripen at the time of death, and therefore cannot propel rebirth into the lower realms, because they have been either completely eradicated through purification or weakened sufficiently that they will not lead to rebirth in the lower realms. So therefore, no matter what situation we find ourselves in, we are not helpless. We are not helpless in the face of the karma we have accumulated. We have the potential to purify previously accumulated non-virtue and to lessen and even put an end to the accumulation of further non-virtue. And in brief, this is done through applying antidotes. Or, to express that differently, it's to weaken the arisal of the afflictions in our continuum. Close the door to the arisal of the afflictions. And to the extent we are successful in transforming our mind so that our habituation to the afflictions weakens, to that extent we close out the door to the potential of rebirth in the lower realms. So therefore, we have a control or influence over our future rebirths.
두신계의 사변 조식 지역에는 두신계의 사원디 고 메타다니 메바서셔나 아니고 야게 두신계 지어 말와 자완 메바서신 계 메르와 제사디 나는 저기 디바디 샤바단 지과차거와 다 사원디 메바 마서바이네 사원 마 여바이네 델야 추몰로는 추메나 아니 긴 추마산은 고 누기 수마 기투 계네 야게 기마와 제사 디나시 긴 가서 사번주 여바 점빙 아주 누구기입니다. 사번디 여나야 델야 게 누버주에나 델야 긴 가르고도 싸고고래 추고고래 죄고고래 긴 망보실 때는 누구기 오마도 긴 망보지 마사나 사번디 여바 점기 누구기 두고 말와 ngazo twendo ro shina di na shin re ngazo dikpa sa je ngaso le ke gi dikpa ji le je sa sha ba ne le sa sa ba de sabon de yor de le ya ke gi jen mang go sang go le ma jen ji ma sa na ji tu go ma ba je za da jen ga re se nyom mo ba de ke cha go di na shin da de sabon ke gi sabon de na ya de le jen chu ma lo ba na chu dan jue me ba na nyu gi gi go ma di na shin chu ma lo ba sha shin na ji tu go di na shin the dikpa di yueba ina ya kiin nyom ba de ngazo ki ma chu ba cha ka sha ba ina de ne digi ki thu yo ma le se pe ro shin di re duk se ne duk shin ga she sa na ne de yo ro duk de men na duk se jo ro ba shin duk su mi le ne gi ne ba ne la ba cha na ne de sa na ne de ji ngu ro ji ma ne de duk shin se go lo de la duk yu be shin de se go ro And
an analogy that will make this clear is if there is a seed, one has a seed of a poisonous plant. If that seed has been destroyed, it will not be able to ripen. This is clear. A seed that has perhaps been crushed or burnt severely will not be able to ripen. Alternatively, if one has not destroyed the seed, but the conditions that are required for it to ripen or sprout into this poisonous plant, if those are absent, it will not ripen. So whatever for example, the appropriate soil is for this seed of a poisonous plant, as well as the required heat and moisture, if any of those are missing, that seed, despite not having been directly harmed, will not be able to ripen because the ripening conditions are absent. So too with non-virtuous karmic seeds on our continuum. If they have been destroyed, of course they can't ripen. But if they have not been completely destroyed, or they haven't even been touched at all, if the ripening conditions are absent, those non-virtuous karmic imprints, karmic seeds, will not ripen. And what are those ripening conditions that are essential for a non-virtuous karmic imprint to ripen? Those are our afflictions, our delusions. So if, or to the extent, we can eradicate or weaken our afflictions, the negative karmic imprints on our continuum will not be able to ripen.
And the name Zang to get seven like Chudia, Chukoran, New Chiguna, Chikitumino, Chudelea, Chukoran, Chikramba, Chitan, Hotse, Chikuma, Yuntana, and Lugur, the Chuyuma Malona, Chuyuntavana, Yavas Kitumnoa. And the Nigeria, the Yomo Bet Korompang Matubane, Yomobody, cook leg money, seven DB lady, Tebudi, 7 Nason like Yelia, Yomobatile, there's also Kuhura, sure. Did the Yomobat, Bengal Bet Korom member swim out to the Yomob Kaze Shukchun Tasha Veneco, Nason Yelia, and Ben Yanewa Jeg, less of an Yewa like Yamatuba, Yomobat Shukchun Tavena. Bet Korapama, didn't either like Yamatuba, didn't do like Yamatu, no more bet Korampang Matuba in a Yomo, but the Shukchun Tasha, when D Kingi, Komani, Nason like Yamatuba, Lady, they would mean Matuba Yungore.
I want this point to be very clear because the purpose of this and many other reflections is to give us strength of mind and encouragement, not to make us feel afraid or helpless. Because if we come out of the meditation feeling like that, we have really missed the point. So if we are able to completely destroy a non-virtuous karmic imprint on our continuum, that would be fabulous. It cannot ripen. It no longer has any potency to ripen. But if we are able to completely eradicate the ripening conditions, the afflictions, that too will serve to make it impossible for these karmic imprints to ripen. But the reality is to completely eradicate the afflictions, in other words, so that afflictions such as attachment and anger and pride never arise. This is an advanced attainment. But nevertheless, even practitioners at our level, we can weaken our afflictions. Through repeatedly training our mind, we can weaken our afflictions. And weakening the afflictions is experienced as them ripening less often, with less frequency and less duration, and less strength. To take this back then to the analogy, if we have the seed, and it's in the seed of a poisonous plant, and it's in the appropriate soil, and there's sufficient sunshine, but there's no moisture, it will not ripen. Or if there is moisture, but it's just a few droplets, that seed will not ripen. So too, with the negative karmic imprints on our continuum, to the extent that we can separate ourselves from our habituation to the afflictions, to that extent, the negative karmic imprints on our continuum will ripen less often, and when they do, will be of less strength and less duration. And in this way, even ordinary practitioners like ourselves can close the door to rebirth in the lower realms.
Bendigo 저기 공로 사이디 내가 저기 녀모바라 디바라와 제상아주 나 저기 때디 중앙아주 냠뇨요로 냠뇨 들리기로 공로 가서 양세야서 사고로와 제사당 아주 공로 사용도 갑라 베네 미치리아 공로 미치키 미니요와체 안에 아주다 공로 사바이나 공로 슉 춘춘사나 공로 사와 점모도 파쇼레 지라 뇌버르치 뇌기 내가디 지라 지고 말와 데네 딜레 공로 쭉 채워 사와나 데는 아주 갈라서네 콜리아 동나보도야다 칙 독자라야 돼 뇌기데 슉 채러지 딜레 빠시 호주 공로 사와나 셔르 슉 침부 슉 사와나 공로 슉 침부 디기기 파쇼리아 뇌든 소 수야기 냥아 침부 샤거로 봐 제자디 공로 슉 채숑기 왕기 파쇼들 뇌바데 나저기 세워 딩아주 세워하고 두라 공로 떼었잖아 슉 춘춘 공로 떼었잖아 파주들이야 이제 공로서거디 직두자다 샤라차 말아제 소소데스 공로사 돼야 마도 샤라라고 말 딜레 슉체슬랍나 동은 넘겨 나고도야나 직도스 두자라지도 다 직두자라는 반에는 뇌그로 와 동넘겨 뇌그로 와 고마기버 책으로 와 디뇌데스 뇌토도 와 딜레 슉체사와네 데네 슈야다 안에 제 속도 나야다 냥아 여러와 디지 슉체문 뇌기도 와 제가 디 뇌야디 공로 슉체숑 원기 아주 디 뇌기요 바디 나도 심주제나 아주 세워하고 두고도 와 어디나시 녀모 슉체숑 원기 메디 나선을 깨야딜레 녀와 깨야다 안에 이달을 깨야다 눈돌을 깨야다 아주 사번도 여러데 긴 녀모 원기 녀모 슉체숑 원기 되네 요야다 아니 녀모 바데네 슉춘 아도 메나 안에 유해나야 되네기 슉춘 마도 메되나 메니기 마도야 돼 요아디 딘스 고레세지
An affliction that is perhaps the most evident to us is that of anger. Anger, when it arises, it's hard not to be aware of it. So if we take this as an illustration, and bearing in mind, whilst one word anger may be used, there is a gradient of anger. So in English we use many words, so we can have annoyance and then frustration, and then perhaps anger and then rage. So we in English we have quite a gradient of words, but they all will fit under the category of the single afflicted mind of anger. So think of varying times when anger of varying strength arose and what that led to. So if the anger was slight, perhaps a frustration or annoyance, that has ripened in one's that one is experiencing this affliction, but one is not overwhelmed. And then depending on the situation, one may well be able to guard what one says and one's facial expression. And let's say we're communicating with a person, we're a bit frustrated with them, but we are able to take control of our mind and not respond in an unskillful manner. Maybe not let on about our annoyance at all. That we will have experience of. Also, thereafter, that anger will quickly be lost, quickly dissipate, and we can go on with our day without any residue from that moment of anger. But should it be a bit stronger, we may still be able to control our speech and the way we respond, but our facial expression may well give away that we've had a negative response to what has been said or done before us. So here, we are acting in a way that brings potentially a little bit of harm to the person before us. Also, we are more likely to have some residue, that a feeling of equilibrium will take longer to return. And thirdly, the anger could rise quite a lot more, and we say something quite harsh to the person before us. Afterwards, we may well regret that, thinking, oh, I may have felt like that, but I really should express myself in an unskillful way. Here we see the harm we've brought to the other person so much stronger, and the residue that will remain with us will be that much longer. And then the final illustration would be full-blown rage. Here we really lose control. Our face is bright red, our eyes are exploding, and we will communicate in a way that's incredibly harsh. Physical violence may also follow. There, the harm that comes to the other person is manifestly clear. It's indisputable. And likewise, the impact on our mind will be long-lasting. It will take, of all this variety of anger, it will take the longest to calm down from. So this we all have experience of. But we can see here that through training our mind, we can have an impact in how we respond. Initially, just the external expression. But as we train more, what happens in our mind to the same stimuli will change, and no anger arises, or far weaker anger arises. So in this way, we can see that whilst we have an abundance of non-virtuous karmic imprints on our continuum, accumulated in this life and previous lives, through taking responsibility for our own mind and our own response to situations, we can, to the extent we weaken our habituation to the afflictions, we weaken the ripening conditions that are required for these negative imprints to manifest. And in this way, we can make it initially much less likely to be born in the hell realms, even the spirit realms, and eventually even the animal realms, by ensuring that the strength of our afflictions is so much weakened, and even at being able to close the door to the possibility of rebirth in the lower realms.
Kale Hawochi Tanga Shisare Sempigi, the Shiegi, some Sansa, the Shisare Sempe, some da Shiegi, the Nigi, Nyanga Kala, Lidu Kabla, and other date capsa de some locaravini, Tama Katangu Warasena, Tanga Dine, and Chiki, Semja, Chasalia, and Chiki. Donga Tower Show, Sempigi, and Jamba Ninjigomia Dam. Dine, and Chiki, Semja Tamji, Diawa the Temple Show, Sempigi, some Jamba come to ya. Di tiso komtune yahuare anyana ajike sosuki echike namgyune and sosuke lama tang and sangelia jumnendelia japsuchi sebeda sanje jumnendi ken sembike sangela devacha sanje tembayina on dinigi semti tempi tone na du jene shi sonwaine gewachi manga sonki mare se la mi ko kwa to tu rese dadi Dipecinala Sunshago Sungoro, Chesa Dene Zangazu, Shisare Sebigita, Shisare Sembe Samota, Denegita, Gale Hawoji, Shiaki, Ken Sambranga Susukita, Chihaguru, Denele Ducabla, and Lamsa, Samnodi, Chigihana, Conjolia, Sanje, Sanje Capsuchi, Sembe Sangelia, Devache, Sanje, Mutuche, Standia, 하나 아니 잠시 셴심전 대화의 템버쇼 심비게 아니 잠바 kom야다 kom 톱나 하나 아니 심전함 주 동아다 자와쇼 심전 동아 뇽모고쇼 심비게 삼다야다 야능이 심전이 가와께와능이 심전의 현리에 펜버주 투가 용와쇼 심비게 아니 되네게 삼다지 한 저기 저게 개와 되네게 기회 삼로 나제 당투바이나 되네 삼다제 니톤파 아니 시소바이나 아니 나서기 말해서 그래
The presentation on the impermanence of this life is followed by the presentation on the lower realms. And this is done, it's presented in this way so as to spur one to focus on virtue in what remains of this life. When one does reflect on the immensity of the suffering of the lower realms, fear and aversion will arise to being born in such a place. And this is used to propel one to be committed to cultivating minds of virtue. When the time of death comes, as it will still come for all of us, then the texts are very clear in the guidance for all of us at the time of death. So if one is able to prepare well for death, then one's mind will be ready because of repeated training over one's life. Particularly if one dies from illness or something like that, where there's a progression, that one can then make effort to prepare oneself for what one knows is coming. But whatever one's circumstances, the advice from the Buddha is to die with a virtuous mind. In particular then, he advises beings that you now, seeing your approaching death, you recognize that this is the reality for all beings. And for beings to have fear at their impending death is normal. So recognize that if fear is arising. But not only that, all beings will fear in their death, will fear their approaching death. Here, intentionally generate the aspiration, I don't want to suffer, nor does any other being. Fear is an instance of suffering. So may all beings, myself included, be free of fear. By my overcoming this fear now, through this merit, may all beings be freed of fear. Here we're generating a mind of compassion, wanting others to be freed of suffering. So that's one technique. But these, I'll present several as separate, but they can be done depending on your training. If you're very familiar with one, just do the one at the time of your death. But for most, they'll do all of these at the time of death. Because a companion to the mind of compassion, the wish for others to be freed of suffering, is the mind of love. Just like I want to abide in happiness, peace, so too do all beings. May all beings abide in peace. May they all abide in lasting, stable happiness. And generate this with a sense of closeness towards all beings. So in this way one generates love. And one can develop this thought further. Wherever I'm born in my next life, I make the commitment now that I will spend my life helping others achieve a state freed of suffering, a state of lasting happiness. This aspiration I've developed now, this aspiration expressed as love and compassion, I commit to living my next rebirths in a manner where I commit to guiding others to develop the causes for lasting happiness and to eradicate the causes that lead to suffering. So this is the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility. So these three are incredibly powerful minds, incredibly powerful virtuous minds. And when one dies with such a virtuous mind, one's propelling karmic imprint to our future rebirth will be virtuous, and therefore one attains a good rebirth. And as the companion to whichever of these, or all three of these virtuous minds, compassion, love, and altruistic attitude, also generate a faith or trust in the Buddha or one's Lama, feeling their presence, knowing that with their omniscient consciousness, they are aware of your impending death, and they are guiding and caring for you. So here, you feel their love and their support and their encouragement in your virtuous training. You are not alone at the time of your death. You are being supported in the generation of these virtuous minds. And you're keeping that connection with your spiritual mentors strong. You can have confidence that you'll encounter them in a different form, but you'll encounter them again in your next rebirths. So this is how, when the time of death comes, we intentionally generate virtuous minds, and through the power of these virtuous minds, in brief, bodhicitta and refuge, we close the door to the possibility of rebirth in the lower realms and ensure rebirth in the upper realms and the happier migrations. And this comes about in dependence on the training that we have done preceding this.
나는 마 어디서 계위 람라 대주 균에네 뉴도 계위고 한 토비 출스. 근데 나 저기 계위 람세데 다다 산지 요고바 토바 지비게 람다 계위기 자와 냠는 제바이나 안에 대기 체들이나 개와사바이나 다 체들이야 안에 탈바다 참지 요고바 토도반다 배야보레스 게시디마토바이네 안 개와치마 하다미고바 토 된된델이야 안 개와 치미기 된델이야 안지 어딘데 냠는 제대는 야 산조고바 토바디 안 용그리에 탈바 탐지기고바 토바 용그리에서 계위 람라 람레 시드네 다 계위 람스는 아주 계위 자와시고 계위 자와 아주 계위 냠는 제대 계위 냠는 샤보직단 냠는 리바 야고데르바네 체델라 안 탈베고바 토투야 용거래 안에 산조고바 토투야 용거래 지로하다 다 게시 체델야 탈바다 탐지 김베고바 토 마두바이네야 안디 냠는 제바디게 개와치말 하다 미고바 토 그래스 덴로 안디 귀네 데텐델라 개와치마 덴델라야 안디 개위 냠는 제발라 데네 안디 뉴르 산조고바 토 그래스 뉴르 개위고바 토비 톱세데.
Continuing in the verse with the next two lines. From the paths of the conquerors come the higher realms, wherein progressive levels of virtue are quickly attained. The paths of the conquerors refers to the paths or the mental paths that the conquerors or all the Buddhas have fully accomplished and have thereby been able to teach ordinary beings like us how to accomplish those self-same mental paths ourselves. So those are the paths of the conquerors. And through training in these paths of virtue, one accomplishes all the spiritual results that one aims for. So rebirth in the higher realms as a human or God. And not only a good rebirth in our next life, in dependence on our motivation, we'll attain such a rebirth in order to continue our spiritual development, to reconnect with our teachers and the Dharma, and to continue to live a life of virtue, cultivating the causes which will lead to liberation and even enlightenment. We'll thereby be able to continue our journey, our spiritual development, to the attainment of those final goals, in particular the goal of enlightenment. So therefore, the paths of the conquerors, again, refers to the mental paths that the conquerors have fully accomplished, have perfected, and are guiding us to develop ourselves. And in dependence on developing, to the extent we develop these paths, or to express it differently, to the extent we cultivate virtue, we will attain higher realms, whereby we'll continue our spiritual development and quickly attain enlightenment.
다디네기 개회 냠는 제바이난 체델레티네 용그레 티키시 체바 마도나 개와치마 덴럴게 디제나 냠는 제발트 용그레 해서죠 도구리 해서 시에다 시사디로와 다디네 인자한다 고 데니게 토비 추 셰버기라 니네신도 솜죠 제자다 냠네지기 림바디 데니게 토비 톱다데 하고 와제 가는 제거데 안 토비 추디 하고 와제 톱수디 니 셰바치네 셰탄 냠는 제타데 하고 와제 하고 원에든 니미레 신도 니레 신도 삼당 고레에세 니레 신도 다디 조어로 슬랍치다 냠는 제 조어티 순고레 데니기 다 데니기 개와체마 하다미고 바토 다데 체텔이야 냠네 림바체바나 타와 담지기 보고 톱토데 냠는데다 림바데다 디게시 마도나 개와체마 하다미고 바토 디텔레 냠는체네 안에 사이고 바토 타바다 담지고 바토 톱을 다디 톱주게 람림바 냠는게 림바디 안에 하고 그래 셰바리 마싱바나 냠는체도 말와 지사 당보싱바 셰고 그래 제 톱수디 디네데 용구에서 하고 그래서 하모가는 셰야 말 지사 하고 전에 된 하고는 되는 소소는 니미레 소소 삼다 냠네 지고를 해서 셰버기래 니네시로 솜스
What's been presented thus far yesterday and this morning is we need to come to recognize the reality of our situation, the incredible preciousness and opportunity that this life brings, but that its duration is finite. It can end at any moment. And after this life comes another, and another, and another. And how those lives turn out is just like this life, dependent on the causes we accumulate. Therefore, look beyond the immediate and take an expansive view over the sequence of lives that lie before us, and focus on accumulating virtue, or to express that differently, focus on accumulating minds which are wholesome, virtuous ways of thinking. Habituate oneself to that. So this verse and the previous ones fit together in this way. Now coming to the next line. Understand this and reflect on it daily. So this line makes two key points. It's imperative to develop knowledge, to gain knowledge. The more knowledge one has, the more opportunities one has before one. This is true in ordinary life, and it's certainly true here. However, whilst one needs to repeatedly over a sustained period continue to gather knowledge on both new and previously subjects that one has encountered, one also at the same time needs to integrate that knowledge within oneself, apply it to one's way of thinking. So these two need to be accomplished together and continuously. There is a danger of either engaging in only one of them, either accumulating a vast store of knowledge and becoming very learned, but that knowledge being left at a mere intellectual understanding, and it not having an impact on one's mind. Or not being so interested in gathering knowledge and just wanting to engage in meditation, but not based on sufficient knowledge. Then too, radical transformation will not follow. These two, the accumulation of knowledge and the integration of that through meditation, need to happen concurrently, repeatedly, over a sustained period. And this sustained period refers to throughout this and future lives, continuously, because we are striving to ensure we attain good rebirths, and in order to continue our spiritual progression towards liberation and enlightenment. So therefore, there's a need to continuously gather knowledge, including on topics that one has already received teachings on, and continue to integrate that through meditation. This is essential to understand. Both of these need to happen concurrently, repeatedly, over a sustained period.
나는 내가 가리네 지산지과로 와다 가서 강바지기 어디 강바되는 수는 야구할 때를 되는 기후여서디 강보수에 다들 신고고로 와다 康波水汤马性白节康波水呢，要过去用头发是吧？就像康波水汤的性，康波水汤的性白呢，那新年的水壶是吧？但水汤性白呢，马水白呢判断是该嘛是吧？就像康波水呢，康波水汤是当波性白节，但那康波水汤性呢，康波水白呢，那判断清不原来的。你那些按这个。卡拉前面呢，但卡拉点的是新不原来是的，但康波卡拉的新不原来卡拉热了呀，卡拉水塘的新过过了哇，水塘马新不的新不水土嘛了哇，就是水塘的新不些，真是水塘的新说呢，水位呢，真的新不原来的，第二性啊这个这些路大半呢，些当堂的当波，看是当国的当波你这当的吃上辛苦活，第新年大白呢，没吃上年不吃那个文化的结果了。第那些人他吃上这个地位的什么第一主要他东方社的当波第一主他东方社他的辛苦活了。第那新年当波第一100的第那新年，那个老人大一点，那个刚没现在没法子第一主图呀的东方社图呀就用过了吧的。
The views in Buddhism, some of them may be quite unique and different from what is generally accepted in society, but the methods of Buddhism are in accordance with what is considered just general common sense. So, for example, the need to gather knowledge and integrate it is how you all have lived your lives, how society lives their lives. For example, everyone likes delicious food. But if one has no idea how to cook, it's not possible to make delicious food. One needs knowledge. But if one has watched many videos on how to make delicious food and has gathered a lot of knowledge, but never cooks, no delicious food will be eaten from that kitchen. So too with singing. So in dependence on one's imprints, one may well have a fantastic natural ability to sing beautifully. But in dependence on training, developing that skill further, and then actually singing, one can bring great benefit, or great joy to others. And so too, if you want a new home, it's insufficient. To have a new home, one needs some knowledge. One needs to understand what kind of home you'd like, what is possible, what really is not, in accordance with one's budget. So this knowledge is required. And the greater the knowledge, the deeper one's knowledge, the better design of house one will have. Even if one isn't the architect, but your conversations with the architect will be far more fruitful. And likewise, if one also has knowledge of building, whilst the builders are then building this designed house, you will be able to ensure that it is going in the way that you want it to. If you have no knowledge, you are blind, you are helpless. So therefore, the more knowledge, the more influence, the greater the outcome, but one also needs to do something, not merely gather the knowledge. So too with our spiritual development. We need to understand which minds are considered wholesome and unwholesome, virtuous and non-virtuous, and why that is the case. Why anger, for example, is never justified. What is really meant by love, for example. And then, moreover, not only do we need to understand what are virtuous and non-virtuous minds and why they are classified as such, but also we need to understand how to develop virtuous minds, how to abandon non-virtuous minds. So this knowledge has to be acquired. But again, leaving it as mere intellectual knowledge will not bring about the desired result of happiness. It needs to also, whilst the knowledge is being accumulated, it needs to be integrated.
Geshe Thubten 디바 사바이나 다 안에 지게 nganjol ma du gore gewa sawa ne denjol ki gor was chesan da nganjo na nganjol ma ki de gi du ya ya gewa ta sa gu du wa san be ge nang bo di shin go da na ka sa shu ba na ji chesan shi du shi na ane nga son de mi ke de tablam gar yo san ane gewa sa gu du wa chesan di ba sa ba na ane di gi nga sol ki gor was chesan da long jue da za xie da ji sun ne ki ke de me ba de se di ne za da nganjo gewa long jue da za 롱주에 다 자시에다 니니들이 시디 편도에 직념도 캐러메 말이 지상 개화도 사바네 두고 지사되는 아주 개화도 사고도 선배게 나보다 개화도 강투도 사기 선배 되네 삼다데 개화 강투도 두기 선배게 나 군노로지 되네시 나보디 삼당고 있어라
What we see here then is we are encouraged to come to both know the stages of training, of stages in which we need to progress, to train our mind, and we need to meditate on them. So I'll briefly recap how to meditate on these stages of training. So incorporating what we looked at yesterday, we need to recognize that we will definitely die. Everyone dies, and we too will die. And the time of my death is completely unknown. The younger do on occasion die before the old. The healthy do on occasion die before the ill. There are so many reasons that will lead to death and so few to sustain life. So death is certain, and the time of death and the manner of death is uncertain. Moreover, though, what is also certain is after this life, another life immediately follows, and that the direction of travel is only in one of two directions. We either remain in the higher realms, or we fall into the lower realms. This too is certain. And which direction of travel we take depends solely on the karma that we have accumulated. When we come to this recognition, to the extent that that recognition is powerful and transformative within us, we will commit to striving in virtue. And this we'll experience this impact with the recognition that whilst I need comfortable possessions, whilst I need possessions for my life to be comfortable and manageable, and close relationships with loved ones and friends and so forth, at the time of death, none of these will help me. So therefore, I should relate to them proportionately, with clear eyes. My focus needs to be on the accumulation of virtue, or wholesome ways of thinking.
개화 같이 두나 동화 세두고 되게 용고래 선배게 삼다에 되네 니베들이야 안에 다 되게 두고야지 나라라 되게 구고래 안에 동화 세고래 디나신당 가서 sem전 나지고 말에 sem전 빠도 매번 쉬쉬어로 왔어 제가 sem전 탐제라 되게 구고래 동화 구고로 왔어 제가 sem전 탐제라 되게 구고도 sem전 탐제 동화 구고 진짜 나라 지고 삼다는 지금 제가 sem전 탐제라 되게 구고도와 지사다 디네자 sem전 탐제 대화대 되나 선배게 땅안 쪽에 잡아고미야 돼 삼다다 디네이세 랑 지고 많이 봐서 sem전 탐제라 되게 구고도 당보 니베 삼 니베 삼다데 랑 되게 좋아 고바나je sem전 탐제라 되게 구고래 나라 동아 미고 바나je sem전 탐제라 동아 미고 구고 말에 제사당이 디네 차상 직버 잔념이 받질라 나라 직부 삼다나 지금도 제사다 sem전 탐제 되게 구고도 sem전 디자 sem전 탐제 대화의 템버쇼 선배게 디네게 삼다제 잠바 sem전 탐제를 삼다제 sem전 탐제 대화의 템버쇼 선배게 디네게 삼다제가 지지도 디네게 지게 karma chik tu tu sekan katse tu tu ne so su du che da dimbe ta ne dine sem de pa shan namyang ga ya ma song wa che ko chike jamba da xi xin dian je ne sem de namyang shan da sam gu de me zhou de me namyang an xi xin dian le ha wo ne jamba ge dian jamba dian je an de dine sem jian tu je de wa de dian ba shu sem be ge da dine ge sam je sem de wa dian ba shu sem be sam lo de pa sam na le yong won du yu je 가제 되토두체 안두시네 고미야디레
The meditation, we've come to the point of the determination to accumulate virtue. We're continuing in the same meditation, having recognized now that from the accumulation of virtue, happiness will follow. And the greater the store of virtue, the greater the happiness that will follow. Now, in the next segment of the meditation, we take our focus, which has been on ourselves and our situation, coming to recognize our own situation clearly. And now we lift our focus, lift our gaze, and observe the situation for all beings, recognizing that all sentient beings are no different from me. We all want happiness. We all want to be freed from suffering. None of us wants to experience any pain or difficulty. We all want to abide in a state of lasting happiness. There's no reason to differentiate between myself and others. My desire for happiness is not any greater than that of others, nor am I more worthy than others to achieve such happiness. We really are all the same. And here we then generate the thought, in the same way that I long for happiness, and I want to experience only happiness, may all beings experience only happiness. May all beings abide in happiness. We generate this thought, and when it arises within us, we just abide with it. Here, this is called the mind of love, which is the wish for all beings to experience only happiness. Our heart now is open and tender towards all beings. Feel the connection with them, the similarity between ourselves and them. With this arisal of love within us, now just rest with it. Up to this point, we've been doing analytical meditation, coming to recognize our situation. Now, with love arising in our mind, rest with it. Use the meditator's companions of mindfulness and vigilant introspection to ensure one stays focused on love. When love starts to wane, regenerate it, repeat the meditation, and again abide on love. So here, we've gone through this meditation, generating virtuous mind after virtuous mind, culminating in the powerful virtuous mind of love. And by abiding or resting, placing the mind on any of the virtuous minds, in this case love, we strengthen our habituation, our familiarization to love. We become more habituated to the mind of love. And all of these virtuous minds, the generation of them, are what is meant by the accumulation of virtue, strengthening our virtuous minds within our continuum. So this is how we accumulate virtue.
Atisha, that's simjan tamje, dungada tawasho, sembiki dungada tawasho, sembiki da dushine gomyadire.
Following the generation of love, generate its companion of compassion. May all beings be freed of suffering.
Atisha, that's simjan tamje, Dewadan Tengudu, simjan dungada takudu, Tinezada, simjan Dewada Dembada, dungada tawading hinji, sembiki, samda, jetu gomyadire.
When love and compassion have arisen powerfully in one, make the determination that this mere aspiration of love and compassion, whilst incredibly virtuous and worthwhile, it is insufficient. Merely wanting, no matter how sincerely, others to be free of suffering and abide in happiness is insufficient. We have a responsibility to others. We have a responsibility towards them. And here, take on that responsibility. Commit to helping others achieve a state of lasting happiness, freed of suffering.
That's simjan tamji dunga dra simjan tamji dunga drawa da ngi chigi sambe samdang de ta simjan tamji dunga drawa de ngi gana chi du nga le je thui ge nga da de nga le yunde mindu chesada deni zada simjan tamji dunga da dra le phando je thu ge de ta chodu gyubadu 가르레스나 상계데 제사다 상계 고바 마톤데 탑민도 지당에 심자 함지 dungadan 자제 심전지 디기 주변이야 당아 상계 고바 토구도 당아를 연대 다 상계 고바의 연대데 가로 고구도 디인자 니 심자 탐지기 된다를 녀 심 탐지 동안 세게 된다래야 심자 탐지기 된다래야 상계 고바 마톤데 탑민도 지사 심자 탐지 상계 고바 토벌쇼 선비게 섬로디 다 되니게 심자 탐지 상계 고바 토벌쇼 선비 섬로디 다양 도시는 고면에
Beginning stages of this meditation were all about coming to recognize clearly our situations, precious rebirth, but its impermanence, and that rebirth will follow in either the higher or lower realms. So this is a key part of the Buddha Dharma, is coming to be clear-eyed about our situation. So too, now in the meditation where we've come to the point of generating love and compassion and the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility, here we look clear-eyed at our own situation and we recognize, whilst I have this sincere wish for others to abide in happiness, freed of suffering, and I take responsibility to ensure that they do so, I do not yet have the ability to actually be able to fulfill this responsibility I have taken on. I cannot yet guide others in the way, in how to accumulate the causes for happiness and how to abandon the causes that lead to suffering. In particular, I cannot guide them perfectly in accordance with their own individual personalities. But that doesn't mean it cannot be done. It just means I am not yet spiritually developed enough, because the Buddhas, they can. They have completely eradicated all faults and developed perfectly all good qualities. They can perfectly guide others. Therefore, I need to become a Buddha. And I need to become a Buddha not so that I can have a blissed out existence, but so that I can be the most skilled of guides and fulfill this responsibility I've undertaken to guide others to attain their own liberation. The achievement of my enlightenment is of primary importance, because sentient beings need me to guide them as soon as possible. Nothing else matters other than the achievement of this goal.
체대다 개와 치마다 탈바다 탐지기 보고 톱투고요 봐 개와 제고를 해야지 뒷배지교 말해서 개와 제고를 해야지 다 개와 제도도 제당한 간에서 제고를 군담지도 안 가서 그러서네 당아주 코비게 라다 현차사 랑디기 되바나시 동할 미되바나시 다 라심제한테 대화 되바 되면 찍바래 대자당이 셈제 대화 찍바래 대자 셈제한테 대화다 덴베게 잠바콤 고구도 사 잠바콤 데네 잠바콤 말씀에 동화der 대도 니지콤 고구도 니지콤 데 콤발에 때네 가용을 세나 안데라 셈제 담지 동화다 다와데 녜지긴 세베 라산 남다리 용고래 제레 니 콤발에 때네 가용을 세나 데네 녜 셈제 담지도 사요고 보토버 지긴 세베게 자슈 셈데 공부 용고래 데디 바티니 용고래 제자다 나보 디테 개와도 콩 내가 손에 깨알 타야리아 개와도 꿰바셰 개와디야 두베디야 랑아 지부마이베 심제 탐지기 된다 삼다제 안에 삼당고야지다 안에 잠바 심제를 잠바 공바제 제네 심제를 니지 공야제 데네 라산 남다 공야제 데네 장슈초도 심제지 디림바디 데네셰야제 다 림바디레와데 곰나 림바디레제 림바시야 톱지 투수데 톱수 되네 심지어 탐지 산조고바 톱을 제시는 장주 심지 군에 라데 되네 개와 주발에 되네 안 산조고바 톱고 그래서 다 톱수디 디시 다다 검수데 가르스네 니미리시도 검세 대시 셰바나시 안데가도 두시네 잠보검 니제검 대 라상검 아니 장주 셈검이야디 다 림바로시디로와 니네 검세 디로와다
We look at the text and we see that one needs to engage in progressive levels of virtue, and one needs to engage in this daily. Take this meditation I've just presented here, and I encourage you to engage in this meditation daily. Because this is the way to transform your mind right now in whatever remains of this life. The first point in the meditation is to develop the foundation for the later meditations. So this is a reflection on preciousness of this life, death and impermanence, and the possibility of rebirth in the upper or lower realms. And the need, therefore, to accumulate virtue. That's the foundation. And that cannot be ignored. It is indispensable. It makes us clear-eyed about what is important and what is not. See things in a truer perspective. But don't leave it just at that, because there one is just striving for, whilst an indispensable goal, the small goal of a good rebirth. In the same meditation, lift your focus. Be aware that what you have recognized about your own situation applies to everyone else too. Those that you care deeply for, those who you don't like so much, and those who you don't yet know and have no particular feeling for. This is the situation for all beings. Use that then as the foundation to generate love, and then compassion, and then the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility and bodhicitta. And in this way, you're accumulating vast stores of merit, of virtue, in that same meditation. And each of these minds are virtuous minds, wholesome minds. And these are the progressive levels of virtue, or progressive levels of training one's mind that the text explicitly refers to. And with an objective of bodhicitta, one has as one's goal to become a Buddha for the sake of others. Therefore, all of these causes become causes for enlightenment. And the last point that we've covered thus far in the verse is the need to engage in these meditations daily. So I encourage you to do so, because whilst it's incredibly beneficial to hear teachings and to take inspiration and do the meditations, one is strengthening imprints in this way. But for the development or the strengthening of those imprints to continue, requires repeated training. Hence the meaning of the word meditation is habituation or familiarization. This is how, by becoming habituated to a wholesome way of thinking, this is how one becomes a wholesome person. So therefore I encourage you to engage in this meditation daily.
Denegi jene samdang gom jene da simjen tamjigi dena sangyo kopang topar sho sembegi denegi gom jansho sem gom yodu da dikpatiya kodigi jansho sem gom begi dikpatiya daru gore jere dikpa daru gore jisanda jansho sem denegi samdang je gewa karsavana sangyo kopang topi gyucha gore jere da denegi tsedele ya ananga zogi dene gom je tsedele an sangyo kopang top matumna an karshigiri labna 개와치 말하다 미고가 토그래 제래 제사 코 톱니 개와치 말하다 미고가 토비 띵데라야 냠렌지에 그 고가브라기레스 고가브라기레스 데네 자티 낀 개와치 마딜이야 무두스 냠렌지에는 니자스 산지고바 토주그레스 어두스네데 고바 토비 주의 안에 두스네 공 용그레스 세대 두슨 거 제사 데네 자당 안주 chanju sem 데네 그 곰지 chanju sem 곰바네 다 디바다야레 안으서는 초사야레 아니 개와치 말하다 미고방 토야레 차상디 죽투 그래 제래
This meditation starts with precious human rebirth, death, the impermanence of this life, and progresses with the generation of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta, then, is the determination to become enlightened in order to lead all beings to a state freed of suffering. Such a virtuous mind accumulates vast stores of merit, firstly, and being a wholesome or virtuous mind, it naturally purifies contrary, unwholesome or non-virtuous minds. So therefore, by generating this wholesome mind, one serves to weaken non-virtuous minds. So here, through this meditation, one is accumulating virtue, purifying non-virtue, and all this virtue becomes a cause for enlightenment, as well as removing and weakening the hindrances to attaining enlightenment. So whilst the goal is enlightenment, a distant goal, whilst the goal of enlightenment is the explicit goal, one implicitly is also accumulating the causes for good rebirths, because in order to achieve enlightenment, one needs a long period of training, lifetime after lifetime. Thereby, one implicitly is creating the causes for good rebirths, wherein one will have the favorable circumstances to continue one's spiritual development and eventually attain the goal of enlightenment. Eventually, these causes will ripen in that final goal of enlightenment.
ane sanje gopang toya ya ane karsan shengi dunda samdamba ane sosuli dunda chenpo di kyabsa chenpo di druktu go wale jirwa da ji shen semje tamchegi dunda samdamba ane sosu sanje gopang totu go wale da shen semje tamchegi dunda samdamba sosu jikbu rang ngarang digi go do ngarang dunga se go sembe samdamba de baina sanje gopang totu go ma dunda kya chenpo druktu go ma re je disumore 지나 베디 나시 베르 마스나 간주디 지당 간주 점을 나라 통수주 교바 점을 나라야 지게 미카시 베트랑 본부 민침보고야 랑 왕지 침보고야 랑 돈다 양양 삼당은 당 되겐 집에나 간시메네 미망보지기 아니 지게 교연통야다 마가와차다 아니 지게 돈다 주야래야 내가 돈다 주베네 아니 풀이야 강아 쳐야지마도 용금민도 와대가 통치 때문에 나라 통치스기 버려와 직세 다야 지소 쉽주시야래 현리야 판별 삼라데 지소라 판별 삼다야게 되네게 현리야 지소 쉽주시야데 판별게 삼다까지 삼다지 레가레간지 유베나 민오신 마신마 민초가지 미디 야고요다 자데 미지게 미 점ling 현다 가와시베나 통마뇽바네 민디 어디 미디 야고요다 미베 야고요서 안지 미차상게 델야 안에 뛰어가 나사다 가우제사다 안델야 안지 담마시위에 성다샤다 되네 담마제는 점ling 나래야 고롱을 지게 된다 게다 첨부차다 되네게 천년다 야고요야 안 미디 시베이네야 그 담냐다데 미냐마 되네 중월에 미디 판도 지소 쉬우를 판도하고 중월에서 해야지 담년다데 하디가 세고로 지자 되네게 인자 당한도 지소 나올 삼다베네 지소 지비 삼까지 숙치에 나지 판배 삼다 레갈랜들라 미차상기 모싱머신기 차상에 거부지야다 통제여바지 랑지부 삼다 와시 주의제시 쉬우체데나 내가 브랭 와시 첨보를 제네 타면에 아니지 내가 브랭 와시베데 갸블로리아 듄르가 라마드네 갸블로리아 균제제가나 마가와 몽보 아네 제마 아네 제게 고합쇼도 델리아 아네 제 균제제제 고랑리아 강아테야다 미디시베네 아니 제망아지도 냥아제 미디 독샤 쇼 미디게 되네 제발에서 곧담 멤버들 하도게 띵아 점리나 통치스기와 차도로 디나신 아주 개위 냠네 제발 샘장 탐지게 돈다 삼다지 내가 제발이네 소소 돈다 개체마 사요고 봐도 죽도 그래서 랑 찍고 삼다지 디게주까지 두베네 안디 타르바 잠 톱투 그러마도 산요고 봐 개체마도 죽도 아마를 해야지 어떤나디 숨거다
Final point to make is to encourage you to do this entire meditation, which has two general parts. The first part is coming to look at one's own situation. The second part is to use this self-awareness, this awareness of one's own situation, and apply it to others. So it's important to do both, because the first is the foundation for the latter. The latter will not come about well without reflecting on one's own circumstances clearly first. But if one only leaves the meditation focused on oneself and one's own determination to gain freedom from pain and misery, one will never attain enlightenment because of one's self-focus. Enlightenment, which is a state focused on the welfare of others, cannot be achieved. So therefore, the sequence of first coming to understand one's own situation and thereafter in the same meditation using this self-awareness to clearly see the situation of others and thereby generate bodhicitta, this sequence is indispensable. And a way to see, a way that one can also relate to this well, is by looking at the situation in the world, not just now, but how it's always been. That those people who are famous, or those that we would have heard from or heard of, one can divide them into two classes. There are those who are primarily focused on their self-interest, and those that are primarily focused on the welfare of others, the benefit of others. So those who are focused primarily on self-interest, they strive for power and influence and dominance. And when they achieve that, they become the famous people we are aware of. And with this power and influence, this longed-for goal that they have now achieved, what also accompanies it is that society has a very divided view of them. Many people will dislike them. They may start out popular, but this does not last. And not only is the view of others towards them at best mixed, but largely often negative, they encounter such people who are concerned only with their own well-being, their own power and influence. They encounter so many problems and difficulties that the exercise of power hardly can be pleasant. Then if we look at another class, those people who genuinely have the interest of others first and foremost, the way society relates to them is vastly different. Society appreciates them, respects them, wants to hear what they have to say, wants to receive their guidance. It is completely different. And when people in either of these categories die, the way they are remembered, the way they live how they live their life is remembered, and who they were perceived to be as persons is remembered, is also vastly, vastly different. So here, you'll be already thinking about famous people in the world, but also think of the people that you know, those who are more self-possessed, self-concerned, self-interested, self-obsessed, and those who are focused on others. You know whose company you prefer to be in. You know who you turn to for guidance and follow that guidance. So this is the result of having an attitude that is either obsessed with one's own situation or being sincerely concerned with the welfare of others. Then thank you very much, and we'll finish there for this morning. Thank you very much.